So, big question. How can we come to understand God who is invisible? Yeah, this is a common challenge and question. And many times, even growing up, there's always been this question, if God exists, how can you prove? There's some things in life you can't quite prove. I remember a quote, for those who have faith, proof is not necessary. And for those who don't, no proof will ever make it, will be enough. So some things you have to kind of take, kind of have faith to understand and believe. But if there was a God, how would we come to understand a God who is invisible? So that's the challenge. In the Bible, Romans 1:20 says, "Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." So this is a clue on how we can actually come to know God or understand God, even though God is invisible. So, according to the relationship of cause and result, or cause and effect, there is this undeniable connection between anything that is created and anything that creates. So one example here is that you can actually understand the nature of an artist by observing his or her artwork, right? Van Gogh, for example, there's a certain kind of style of painting that he does where if you look at his paintings, you can immediately tell, oh, that must be one of Van Gogh's paintings, because there's certain common elements in everything that he painted that reflects his nature. Another way of saying it is that there's nothing created that doesn't, nothing can be created without the creator having the same elements that the creator created. I don't know if that was confusing, but point is, if we want to understand God's nature, and if we believe that God created the universe, then we can actually decipher God's nature by observing what God created, especially if there's some common elements that we notice in what God created. Does that make sense? Okay, so the principle discloses two kind of key common elements. Number one, everything in this world has both an external physical form and also an internal driving force or internal driving nature. So even a rock, it looks like there's nothing going on in a rock, right? It looks like it's just an external material thing. But if you really look down into the details, there is activity happening between the particles and the molecules, the electrons and protons. There is activity happening there. So there is this driving force even within something as solid as a rock. Same thing with plants, there's the external form of every plant, but there's something that drives it to grow, to turn towards the sun. There's this internal nature that drives it. Animals, same thing, they have an instinct. One example that I recently heard is like the monarch butterfly can fly, thousands of miles, to the same destination of which it was born, or where its, I guess, parents were born. And, what guides that? There's something that they instinctively know, even though no one taught the animal or the butterfly to do, they just instinctively know how to do. And humans, also, we have this kind of, what makes us human is not just our physical form. We have a personality, we have intellect, all of this kind of nature, our mind, our soul. This is a key element of what makes us human. Because if you take those things out, it's just a physical body. Imagine a corpse, right? Would you call that human? No, because there is a body, but there's something internal, invisible, that actually drives the nature of that person. So we can conclude from looking and observing at all of creation that because everything has both an internal nature and external form, God must also have this kind of internal nature and external form. One more common element that we see in all of creation is that there is both masculinity and femininity in all creation. So from the very small particles, there's the protons and the electrons flying around it. In molecules, you have the cations and the anions to balance it out. Plants have stamen and pistil to help procreate. Same thing with animals. There's male and female, and humans, man and woman. But again, by observing all of creation, we can come to understand that God must also be both masculine and feminine. Right? This might be mind-blowing, but because we typically, even in the Bible, typically we address God as Father or He, so on and so forth. But there is one quote that says, God created male and female, or man and woman, in His image. He created them. So if God created everything feminine in this world, then there must be a feminine nature within God as well. Does that make sense? Otherwise, if God didn't have those elements, He would not be able to create feminine aspects. So if we're to believe that God is the creator of the universe, then we must also assume, and we can actually discern, that God must also have both a masculine and feminine nature. And finally, we covered internal, external, we covered masculine, feminine. There is one more thing that's really important to understand. Of all creation, human beings were the final creation and the most important creation. And how do we know that? Again, in the Bible, it says, God created in His image, God created them. So that means that human beings were created in most likeness with God. So if we dive into the human nature, we can understand that, as humans, part of the driving force, our internal nature, is made up of our mind. And our mind has three primary functions. It has the intellect, the emotion, and the will. And the driving force of all of these three functions is our heart, or another way of saying that is our impulse to love. Our impulse to love. Okay, that's really the core driving force of human beings. So, when we experience these things as human beings, especially for those who've experienced love or experienced having children, it's unbelievable how much, this kind of love we can experience in relationship with particularly our spouse and our children. And if we know that we are also created in God's image, then we must assume that God must also have this kind of love for us. You know, if we are that much in love with our children and we care for them and we worry about them, how much more must God, this divine being, care and love for us? So in summary, according to the principle, by the law of deduction, we can actually identify that God is a harmonized being of both external form and an internal nature. God is also a being of both masculinity and femininity. But finally, also God is a personal parental being with a heart, which drove the motivation to create the universe in the first place. So this is a clue into really what we'll cover later in Principles of Creation number 2 as to why God created in the first place. By looking at our nature as human beings, we can get a clue into God's heart and God's motivation for creation. But we'll cover that later. So this is really cool, okay? Through a scientific, kind of semi-scientific method, we can actually deduce the nature of God through observing God's creation. So the other thing we like to cover in this segment is 3 universal principles. So similar to in science, we have hard sciences like the law of physics and biology and chemistry. And these are things that, you know, is more of a external measurable sciences that have been developed. There's also universal internal principles that exist. And if we're aware of that, then similar to understanding the law of physics and biology, we can actually better function as human beings by both, again, being masters of the external science, but also learning and educating ourselves on the internal principles that actually drive our internal nature, our relationships, you know, fulfillment, happiness. Those are more of an internal nature things. So we're going to cover 3 key principles, which I think will be very useful and helpful for you to understand. So those 3 are listed here: give and take action, universal prime energy, and the 4-position foundation. And again, I'm going to try to explain it as simple and clearly as possible so that we can make it easy to apply. So the first is give and take or give and receive action. So what this simply means is that everything in the universe requires interaction to create energy. And that actually that's what allows things to exist, is this interaction. There needs to be give and take for anything to actually exist. And this is stimulated by what we call universal prime energy, or kind of God's energy. So you need kind of this invisible universal energy that drives this interaction of give and take in everything. So for example, we talked about, you know, the molecules of, you know, electrons and protons. You know, what makes it tick? What makes everything function? We were naming it universal prime energy, or God's kind of force that really is what drives all interaction of give and take between molecules, between our mind and body, between every interaction that we see in the universes. And this universal prime energy, it's not just neutral. It's not like clockwork. There is a intention behind it. So Universal prime energy directs all interactions towards harmony and development. Harmony and development. This is important. There is a design. If you look at nature, you know, everything is in balance. You know, it's not haphazard. It's not random. In nature, everything, if you look at ecosystems, every aspect, the carbon dioxide that the plants give off is actually that the oxygen that the plants give off is what we need. And then the animals give off carbon dioxide, which is what the plants need, you know, and there's much more complicated ecosystems that exist. So this universal prime energy really drives everything towards harmony and development. There is an intention for harmony. This is really important because God is in harmony. God is creator. There is a design behind how things are supposed to interact. Okay, and similarly, how it applies to us is that what we choose to interact with affects our own energy. Okay, so every kind of interaction that we choose, that we have a choice in interacting. So a simple example is, you know, if we choose to listen to, you know, angry music, then it affects us. It affects our mood. Or if we choose to listen to peaceful music, it actually helps us be more peaceful. So every interaction, it has an effect to our own energy as well. And finally, the 4-position foundation. So this is a very simple diagram. So ultimately, the give and take action between any two entities as subject and object, they're meant to create this 4-position foundation where God or God's purpose is at the center, which is love and harmony, and the subject and object are meant to interact with each other centered on that purpose, which creates a harmonious union. So how do we apply this concept in our own lives? So an example of that is in creating healthy relationships with others, the way that we're able to do that is we tap into the source of love, which God has, and have this intention of giving love to a partner. And when we're able to tap into that source of love and give love to others unconditionally, then naturally the object responds in kind and it creates this harmonious union in our relationship. And this is what we call having a relationship centered on God. Now, this is not always easy. In fact, it takes quite a bit of practice and intention to be able to do. But if we trust that God is the source of love and that God intended everything to be in harmony, it actually is us to learn how to tap into that source. And it makes sense that when we don't, we see conflict in this world. So as, how do I say, seemingly unscientific as it sounds, it makes sense that because there is a power of intention, that if we tap into the highest source of love and harmony, which is God, then we intentionally include that in our relationship, then we're going to experience more love in our lives. We're going to be able to create more harmony in our lives. And the opposite being true, that when we deny that, when we don't tap into that higher source of love, then we don't have the love to give others. And we're more desiring to receive love. And then when both sides are wanting to take from each other, there's no harmony. There's no union. So really the only way to make everything flow as God intended is if we acknowledge and tap into God as a source of love. And then and only then can we really create and apply this 4-position foundation and create more harmony, experience more love, and really ultimately contribute to building God's kingdom here on earth, starting with our personal relationship within our family. So that concludes the presentation today on the introduction to the divine principle and the first part of the principles of creation.